Welcome to Russian History Retold, Episode 319, The History of Moscow. Last time, we finished a two-part series on the Metropolitans and Patriarchs of the Russian Orthodox Church. Today, we will start another series focusing on three of the most important cities in Russian history: Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Kiev. Before we get into the history, let's talk about Moscow as it is today. Apart from being the most populous city in Europe, with about 13.5 million people residing in it, it is one of the world's largest cities, covering some 26,000 square kilometers or 10,000 square miles. It is presently the capital of Russia, something it regained from St. Petersburg in 1918 when the Bolsheviks moved the capital. It then became the capital of the Soviet Union from 1921 until the dissolution of the USSR in 1991. Moscow has many unique characteristics, including being the world's coldest and northernmost megacity. It is tied with Hong Kong as having the second most billionaires behind New York City. It has several UNESCO heritage sites within its boundaries, including Red Square, St. Basil's Cathedral, and the Moscow Kremlin. It has also been rebuilt numerous times, often because of devastating fires. Between 1330 and 1453, there were 17 major conflagrations. In 1812, we have the fire purposely set to refuse sanctuary to Napoleon and his Grande Armée. Between those two periods, there were so many fires in Moscow that we don't even know how many really occurred. As one 17th century visitor commented, quote, "To make a conflagration remarkable in this country, there must be at least 7,000 to 8,000 houses consumed." Moscow's history can be divided into 6 different time periods. We begin with the early foundation period, which occurred between the 9th and 13th centuries, followed by the rise of Moscow as a power center in the 14th and 15th centuries, the early Tsarist period in the 16th and 17th centuries, Imperial Russia in the 18th and 19th centuries, then the Russian Revolution, Soviet-era Moscow, and the post-Soviet era. The prehistory of the city is very much like that of others in what is now Russia. We have evidence of both Neolithic and Iron Age settlements in the area. It would be an important trade route used by Turkic, Germanic, and Slavic peoples in the 8th through 11th centuries. The city sits on the Moskva River, about 400 miles or 640 kilometers southeast of St. Petersburg, and 300 miles or 480 kilometers east of the border with Belarus. The Moskva River is a tributary of the Oka, linking it to the Volga. This is a major reason why it became such an important city over the years. We first hear about Moscow in 1147 in a letter by Prince Yuri Dolgoruki of Kiev sent to one of his allies, Sviatoslav Olgovich, inviting him to a meeting at a location he referred to as Moscow. At this time, Moscow was just a small settlement near the confluence of the Moskva River, situated in a strategic location for trade and defense. This location and its relative anonymity would be a major factor in Moscow's growth in size and power. This was mainly due to the Mongols' invasion of Russia, which happened, of course, first in 1221, then the larger incursion between 1227 and 1240. When the hordes stormed through the countryside, Moscow was still a small village. The larger cities, such as Vladimir, Tver, and Kiev, were the main targets. Still, Moscow was burned to the ground, and many of its inhabitants were killed. Still, it would survive as it was easily rebuilt and was further away from the main Mongol strongholds. Additionally, it would be run by a number of insightful and brilliant princes who would develop a stronger relationship with the horde than those who led other major cities. The first of these men was Daniil of Moscow, the youngest son of Alexander Nevsky. Daniil Alexandrovich would be the forefather of the princes of Moscow, known as the line of Danilovichi. When his father died in 1263, Danil was only 2 years old and was given what was thought to be the least valuable city under Alexander's control. It wasn't until 1282 that Danil became the sole ruler of Moscow after his uncle and regent Yaroslav of Tver passed away. Due to infighting within the Golden Horde, Danil had to be really careful on which side to back, as any mistake could, and at times did, lead to punitive attacks on Moscow by the other side. But, in the end, he made the right choices, which led to the city's further growth. It would come under fire and lose some of its prestige under his heir, Yuri I. The next Veliki Knyaz, who would set Moscow on its path to greatness, Ivan I, was also known as Ivan Kalita, translated to Ivan Moneybags. Ivan's shrewdness in his dealings with the horde and the capital, Sarai, allowed him to gain preeminence in the power struggles between the many principalities in the region. By being the best tax collector for the Mongols, they would lend their support for his plans to absorb all of the surrounding territories. Not only did Ivan gather payments for the horde, he kept some of it for himself and his city. Ivan would be instrumental in having the seat of the Russian Orthodox Church moved from Vladimir to Moscow in 1326. He would be able to use this to push back at any enemy, as that would make them enemies of Christ. The building of churches would be a mainstay of Ivan and his successors for centuries to come. The importance of this decision was amplified when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Empire in 1453, when Vasily II was the head of the Principality of Muscovy. He would have Moscow proclaimed to be the Third Rome, as it was the last seat of Orthodoxy. While Ivan I set the stage for the expansion of the Principality of Moscow, it would be one of his scions, Ivan III, also known as Ivan the Great, who would launch the city to incredible heights. Under Ivan, the Russians would throw off the Mongol yoke in 1480, elevating his seat of power in Moscow above all others. He would be the first to use the term Tsar in correspondence with other rulers. Towards the end of Ivan's rule, Moscow was populated with around 100,000 people, making it one of the largest in all of Europe. He would also improve on its defenses, especially the Kremlin. During his reign, Ivan increased the size of the Principality of Muscovy from 430,000 to 2.8 million square kilometers. Italian architect Petrus Antonius Solarius led the rebuilding of the Kremlin, which is the wall design we see today. Another addition to the city was the first appearance of the Red Square, which was originally named the Hollow Field. It was in Moscow that some of the iconic architectural styles, such as the onion domes, were developed. Two significant fires would hit Moscow. One in 1547, in which it was a whole substantial part of the city was destroyed, and the one in 1571, when the Crimean Khanate attacked. These fires killed an estimated 170,000 of Moscow's 200,000 residents. Due to a historic famine that gripped most of Russia between 1601 and 1603, it was the time of troubles, and plagues that killed upwards of 80% of the people in 1654 and 55, Moscow would not return to a population of 200,000 until the late 17th century. Another burst of activity occurred under the reign of Ivan Grozny, Ivan IV. He would order the construction of one of the most iconic churches in the world, St. Basil's. From there, we enter the imperial era of Russian history, which coincided with Moscow's decline in importance due to Tsar Peter the Great's moving the capital to his newly built city to the north, St. Petersburg, a city we will discuss in the next episode. With the move to St. Petersburg of almost all governmental operations, Moscow rapidly declined as nearly half of the more talented citizens were actually forced to go to the new capital. It would become a provincial capital, or as Pushkin would describe it, quote, a faded dowager queen in purple mourning clothes obliged to curtsy before a new empress. Peter really hated Moscow, as it was the set for the murder of a number of his relatives when the Streltsy rebelled in 1682. The Tsar viewed Moscow as being everything that was wrong and backward with Russia. Catherine II viewed Moscow during her reign as, quote, the seat of sloths, full of symbols of fanaticism, churches, miraculous icons, priests and convents side by side with thieves and brigands. She had plans to rebuild the city, but it had to be scuttled due to a lack of adequate funding. The plan came about after the Black Plague swept through the city in 1770, and there many homes were burned to the ground. But this wasn't the fire that would cause the city to be completely rebuilt. As I mentioned earlier, it would be the self-destruction of the city when Napoleon entered it in 1812. Gone were the winding, narrow streets, the trading stalls in Red Square, and the old architectural monstrosities. The nobility helped fund the reconstruction as they wanted to revive their old ancestral homes. But it wasn't a copy of St. Petersburg. It was a mix of traditional Russian architecture along with more modern construction methods and materials. In his book, Natasha's Dance, Orlando Figes claims that Tolstoy compared what happened in Moscow's rebuild to, quote, the way that ants return to their ruined heap, dragging off bits of rubbish, eggs, and corpses, and reconstructing their old like with renewed energy. Despite St. Petersburg becoming the capital of Imperial Russia, Moscow was still a central city and an economic powerhouse that bisected the north from the south, Europe from Asia. You could still see the influence of the Mongol horde along with Slavic and Byzantine features. Ancient and native Moscow was a unique city in the early 19th century. The construction of the Bolshoi Ballet was completed in 1824, along with the Alexander Gardens, as well as the Boulevard and Garden Rings, which are still the main ring roads in Moscow. The rebuilding of Moscow after the Napoleonic invasion was an important reclamation project. It created the center of the Rus, which sharply contrasts with St. Petersburg. This is how Gogol viewed the differences. Quote, Petersburg is an accurate, punctual kind of person, a perfect German, and he looks at everything in a calculated way. Before he gives a party, he will look into his accounts. Moscow is a Russian nobleman, and if he's going to have a good time, he'll go all the way until he drops, and he won't worry about how much he has in his pockets. Moscow does not like halfway measures. Petersburg likes to tease Moscow for his awkwardness and lack of taste. Moscow reproaches Petersburg because he doesn't know how to speak Russian. Russia needs Moscow. Petersburg needs Russia. Part of the issues between Moscow and Petersburg in the hearts of Russians come from the perception of Peter the Great amongst the populace. To some, he was an antichrist, especially to the Cossacks and the Old Believers. They viewed him as more of a German than a Russian. In their eyes, Moscow was more Russian, and hence the superior city. Another difference between the two cities of 19th century was Moscow's quote-unquote party atmosphere. It was no longer the capital of Russia, so it kind of let its hair down. Ivan Turgenev wrote the following about the former capital. Quote, Moscow is an abyss of hedonistic pleasure. All its people do is eat, drink, sleep, go to parties and play cards, and all at the expense of the suffering of their serfs. At this time, it became one of the most gourmand cities in the world. Some saying it bypassed Paris for the number and variety of restaurants. Banquets of enormous size were commonplace. All the while, the serfs and peasants would eke out a meager existence. This change in the eating culture was dramatic, as in the 17th century, Moscow's menu was pretty plain. As Figes writes, quote, fish, boiled meats, domestic fowls, pancakes, bread and pies, garlic, onion, cucumbers and radishes, cabbages, and beetroots. Figes also writes about the incredible alcoholic drinking problems that Russians had, especially those partying in Moscow. He claimed that, quote, deaths from drinking claimed 1,000 people every year between 1841 and 1859. Figes also mentioned that this was not an ancient problem. It only popped up in the late 18th century. The cause was the enormous profits that the gentry was able to make by selling spirits, especially vodka. Moscow would trudge through the reigns of Nicholas I, Alexander II, and Alexander III. But we begin to rise in importance and tragedy during the rule of Tsar Nicholas II. It was in 1894 that the Kadynka Field tragedy, with the death of hundreds being trampled during the coronation celebration of the new Tsar. While Petersburg was the capital, Moscow was the historical seat of Russia and where the Tsars would have the crown set on their heads. Discontent with the government had two main centers, St. Petersburg and Moscow. Strikes spread throughout central Russia, especially in Moscow during the mid-1890s. In 1905, the Moscow printers started a nationwide strike against the Tsar and his policies. This led to the unsatisfactory issuance of the October Manifesto. Tsar Nicholas II had a special affinity for Moscow. He viewed St. Petersburg as too European and Moscow as more Russian, which is really, truly ironic, because Nicholas himself was 97% German. While Nicholas liked Moscow because of its old Russian style, he stayed closer to St. Petersburg and never really contributed much to the development of the older city. This would change with the coming of the Bolsheviks. Their first reason for moving the capital from the northern city was due to its closeness to the front-line fighting during World War I. They believed that St. Petersburg, then called Petrograd, was threatened and that moving deeper into the country would be a good idea. This would have a double benefit when World War II came about due to the threat from Nazi Germany. As you know, Leningrad, renamed from St. Petersburg and Petrograd, was under siege for over 800 days. And while Moscow was threatened, it was far easier to defend. Under Joseph Stalin, the city of Moscow would undergo a major redo. By the early 1930s, Moscow was a mess. The person Stalin would turn to in an effort to rebuild the capital was a total surprise to many. It was Nikita Khrushchev. At the time, he was considered somewhat of a dullard, but as an associate with Lazar Kaganovich, who was the real boss of the project, he was very well connected. The city was also being inundated with new residents with nowhere to stay. There was a system in place called Propiska, which limited the ability to immigrate to Moscow. It was unable to completely control the number of people who fled to the cities after the famines of the Russian Civil War. In 1931, there were an estimated 411,000 people who moved to Moscow, and 1.5 million between the years 1928 and 1933. Building enough homes was incredibly important to take care of the influx, as was the construction of the Moscow Metro train system. The train system, as it stands today, is the 8th longest in the world, the longest in Europe, the longest outside China, and averages about 7 million passengers a day. Its first station was opened on May 15, 1935, and was named L.M. Kaganovich Metro, until it was rededicated as the Moscow Order of Lenin L.M. Kaganovich Metro. Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union for its 80-plus years of existence, was a center of construction and development. Still, we know how poor those choices in construction were. Apartment buildings were boxy, and their architecture was unimaginative. Many of the high-rise apartments were symmetrical in design, which was a common theme throughout the Soviet era. Some of the buildings, though, erected in Moscow during the Soviet era, were pretty impressive, especially Moscow State University, which was built between 1849 and 1953. These structures were known as wedding cake skyscrapers. After the Soviet collapse, Moscow underwent a number of changes due to the influx of capital and the influx of wealthy people. Its population also boomed since 1991, going from about 8.7 million to 13.5 million today. Moscow is currently experiencing a mix of challenges and developments. The ongoing Russia-Ukraine war continues to have significant impacts on the city, with reports of Russian forces engaging in combat and territorial changes. The conflict has also led to economic sanctions and political tensions with other countries. On a more local level, Moscow is still dealing with inflation and economic pressures, which have affected the cost of living and availability of goods. Despite these challenges, the city remains a major political, cultural, and economic hub in Russia. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Join me next time when we cover the history of one of the other major cities in Russia, St. Petersburg. So, until next time, до свидания и спасибо за внимание.